The sun goes down early on the frontier. Not dramatically, it just sort of gives up and leaves. For frontier families, this is the moment when the real work begins, because surviving the coldest nights was never about bravery or adventure. It was about routine, patience, and not freezing quietly in your sleep. If you enjoy this kind of slow, uncomfortable history, remember to quietly subscribe. No rush, the cold will still be here when you're done. A frontier house, if we are generous with the word house, was usually a small wooden structure with gaps everywhere, between logs, around doors, under floors. The wind did not knock. It entered freely, inspected the place, and settled in for the night. Families knew this. They did not try to stop the cold entirely. They planned around it, the way you plan around an unpleasant relative who refuses to leave. As evening approached, the fire became the center of existence, not for warmth alone, but for survival. The fire was fed carefully because wood was never unlimited. Too much too fast meant running out before morning. Too little meant waking up with ice in your breath. Someone, often the lightest sleeper, was responsible for waking in the night to add more logs. This was not heroic. It was miserable and expected. Clothing did not come off at bedtime. Layers stayed on. Wool, linen, sometimes animal hides, all stiff from use and smoke. Frontier families slept fully dressed, sometimes with hats still on. Children were packed together like supplies, not for affection, but for shared body heat. Privacy was not a concept that survived winter. Beds were not soft. They were wooden frames filled with straw, corn husks, or whatever could be found that vaguely resembled cushioning. Over time, the stuffing flattened, shifted, and poked back. Blankets were heavy, itchy, and precious. Often they were shared, folded, or layered unevenly, depending on who complained least. Before sleeping, families prepared the room itself. Doors were blocked with cloth. Cracks were stuffed with rags, old paper, or dried grass. Sometimes furniture was moved to act as a barrier against drafts. This did not stop the cold. It slowed it down slightly, which was considered success. Water was another problem. Anything left out could freeze solid by morning. So drinking water was kept close to the fire or wrapped carefully. Sometimes it still froze anyway. Morning routines often began with melting ice rather than washing. Night sounds on the frontier were different in winter. Wood cracked as it shrank in the cold. The wind howled through gaps like it was testing them. Snow piled up silently, which somehow felt louder than noise. Families learned to ignore these sounds because fear burned energy they could not spare. Illness was constant. Cold weakened the body, especially in children and the elderly. Coughs lingered. Frostbite happened quietly, without drama, starting with numb fingers and toes. Medical help was distant, if it existed at all. Most treatment involved endurance and hoping spring arrived before things worsened. Morning did not bring relief. It simply meant the fire had to be rebuilt, the ice scraped away, and the same process repeated. Survival was not a single victory, but a long series of small, boring successes. You stayed warm enough, you woke up, you did it again. For frontier families, surviving the coldest nights was not about overcoming nature. It was about cooperating with it, reluctantly, night after night, until winter finally lost interest and moved on. And when winter truly settled in, frontier families adjusted their expectations downward. Comfort was no longer the goal. The goal was to remain functional enough to keep doing chores tomorrow. Nights were endured, not enjoyed. Sleep came in short, shallow stretches, interrupted by the fire fading, the cold creeping closer, or a child quietly shivering beside you. Animals played an unglamorous but important role. In some cabins, livestock was brought inside or kept just beyond a shared wall, not because anyone enjoyed the smell, but because animals produced heat. A cow or a few chickens nearby could raise the temperature just enough to matter. This arrangement was unpleasant, loud, and effective. Frontier logic favored effective. Food helped, though not in comforting ways. Heavy meals were eaten before bed when possible. Fat, bread, stews that sat in the stomach like a weighted blanket. Digestion created warmth, slowly and reliably. There were no midnight snacks. There was no surplus. If you were hungry at night, you learned to fall asleep faster. Candles and lamps were used sparingly. Light meant fuel, and fuel meant survival later. Darkness arrived early and stayed. Families learned to move around the cabin by memory, counting steps, reaching for familiar edges. Stubbed toes were common. Complaining was optional and usually discouraged. Children adapted quickly because they had to. They learned which spots were warmest, which blankets were least drafty, and which adult radiated the most heat. Stories were told quietly before sleep, not for entertainment, but to distract from the cold long enough for exhaustion to win. Voices stayed low to conserve energy and oil. Even breathing felt different. Cold air made lungs ache. Frost formed along windows if there were windows at all. Sometimes families woke to find thin ice inside the cabin, clinging to walls or bowls left too close to the edges. This was noted, corrected if possible, and accepted if not. Fire safety was a constant worry. Cabins were dry, sparks were dangerous. Falling asleep too close to the fire could mean never waking up. Falling asleep too far from it meant the same thing, just slower. Families learned the careful balance of distance, embers, and timing, all without alarms or clocks. When storms came, nights grew longer in every sense. Snow blocked doors. Wind pressed against walls like it wanted in. Sometimes it succeeded. Families stayed still, listening, conserving heat and patience. Digging out came later. Surviving the night came first. Loneliness was another quiet companion. Frontier nights were isolated. Neighbors were far away, invisible in the dark and snow. Help was not coming if something went wrong. This reality sat heavily in the silence. People did not talk about it much. Talking did not change it. Spring, when it finally arrived, was not celebrated loudly. It was acknowledged with tired relief. Survivors noticed how much thinner the blankets felt, how worn the clothes had become, how everyone coughed a little less. Winter left marks, even when it didn't take lives. For frontier families, the coldest nights were not heroic trials remembered fondly. They were repetitive tests of endurance that blurred together. Each night was survived using the same small strategies, the same careful habits, the same quiet determination to wake up again. And in the end, that was enough. Over time, frontier families developed a strange intimacy with the cold. They could sense it before it fully arrived, the way the air thickened, the way the fire behaved differently, the way sound traveled less at night. Cold was no longer just temperature. It was a condition that shaped decisions, moods, and even conversations. People spoke less when it was very cold. Words felt like wasted warmth. Sleep positions became strategic. Families learned which side of the bed was least exposed, which corner caught the fewest drafts. Children were rotated during the night, not ceremoniously, just quietly nudged closer to warmth when they drifted too far. Nobody asked permission. Survival outranked politeness. Blankets were adjusted constantly. Too tight and you restricted circulation. Too loose and cold air crept in. The act of tucking in became precise, almost practiced. Edges were weighed down with clothing or tools. Sometimes a warm stone from the fire was wrapped in cloth and placed near feet. It worked for a while, then it cooled, like everything else. Dreams were affected. Cold seeped into sleep, producing restless nights and strange, half-waking thoughts. People dreamed of warmth, of summer fields, of sitting in sunlight without needing to count firewood. Waking up felt abrupt because the body never fully relaxed in the first place. Noise discipline mattered. Opening a door too often let warmth escape. Shifting too much stirred cold air. Families learned to lie still, even when uncomfortable, because movement had consequences. The stillness of frontier nights was not peaceful, it was calculated. Tools were kept close. Axes, knives, boots, all stayed within reach in case something went wrong. A fire could fail. A storm could damage the roof. A sick child could need attention immediately. Preparedness extended into sleep. You rested lightly, ready to wake. Outside, the landscape did not care. Snow buried paths. Rivers froze solid. Wolves and other animals moved closer to human settlements, drawn by scraps and shelter. Their distant sounds reminded families that they were not alone, just isolated. This was oddly reassuring. Morning routines began before sunrise because light was irrelevant in winter. Someone rose, stiff and reluctant, to revive the fire. Hands shook. Breath fogged the room. Ice was chipped away. The day started exactly where the night ended, with effort. Looking back, it is tempting to frame this as resilience or strength. Frontier families would not have used those words. They would have called it normal. This was simply what winter demanded, and refusing was not an option. The cold was patient. It always waited. Surviving the coldest nights was not a single skill, but a collection of habits repeated until they became automatic. Feed the fire, share warmth, waste nothing, expect discomfort, sleep lightly, wake up anyway. Eventually, the nights shortened. The fire lasted longer. Snow melted just enough to make everything muddy and unpleasant in a new way. Winter loosened its grip without apology. Frontier families noticed, adjusted, and kept going. They did not tell stories about these nights later because there was nothing impressive to describe. Just long darkness, careful fires, shared blankets, and the quiet relief of another morning. And that, unexciting as it sounds, is exactly how they survived. Even after many winters, the cold never became friendly. It became familiar, which is different and not nearly as comforting. Frontier families did not grow numb to it emotionally. They simply stopped reacting outwardly. Complaints faded because they solved nothing. Silence in winter was efficient. Time behaved oddly at night. Without clocks, darkness stretched endlessly. People measured hours by the fire's behavior, by how often someone had already woken to tend it, by how stiff their joints felt when they shifted position. A long night was not counted in minutes, but in how many times you considered getting up and decided not to. Shared sleeping meant shared responsibility. If one person stirred, others noticed. If the fire weakened, someone moved. This created a quiet rhythm, unspoken and cooperative. There was no leader during the night. Everyone was equally uncomfortable, and that made decisions simpler. Footwear stayed close. Boots were never placed too far from the bed because frozen leather was nearly impossible to put on quickly. Sometimes boots were brought under blankets to keep them pliable. The smell was unpleasant, but frozen feet were worse. Priorities were clear. Condensation was another small problem that never fully went away. Breath collected on walls and ceilings, then froze, then melted slightly when the fire was rebuilt. Moisture crept into bedding and clothing, making everything heavier and colder by morning. Dryness was rare and valued. Children learned early that night was not for wandering. Getting up unnecessarily meant letting cold air in and warmth out. Bedtime rules were strict, not moral, just practical. If a child cried, they were pulled closer and quieted quickly, not harshly, but firmly. Cold punished noise. Illness during winter nights felt more threatening. A fever in a cold cabin was alarming. Sweat chilled the body. Shivering, exhausted, already weak muscles. Families improvised care with extra layers, warm stones, broth if it existed. Watching through the night was common. Sleep became secondary. Sometimes the fire went out completely. This was not rare, just deeply unpleasant. Waking to a dead hearth meant moving fast without panicking. Fingers fumbled. Sparks were coaxed from embers if any remained. If not, starting fresh in freezing darkness tested patience and resolve. Success was quiet relief. Failure was dangerous. Snowstorms erased the outside world. Sounds disappeared. Familiar landmarks vanished. Frontier families knew that if something happened during these nights, no one would arrive until weather allowed it. This knowledge sat heavily but was not discussed. Fear, like cold, was managed through routine. Food supplies were checked repeatedly during winter evenings, not because they changed, but because reassurance mattered. Knowing there was enough to last the night, the week, the season, brought a thin layer of calm. Running out did not happen suddenly. It approached slowly, like the cold itself. As weeks passed, bodies adapted slightly. People lost weight, muscles tightened, skin cracked, but they also learned efficiency. Movements became smaller. Heat was conserved instinctively. The cabin felt less foreign, even when it remained uncomfortable. When someone died in winter, there was little ceremony at night. Bodies froze quickly. Funerals waited. Grief was postponed until daylight, until weather allowed proper actions. Winter did not make room for emotion on its schedule. Eventually, a subtle change arrived. Nights were still cold, but less cruel. The fire lasted longer without tending. Morning light appeared sooner. Frontier families noticed these signs without celebration. Hope was cautious. Winter had taught them not to trust improvement too early. Survival, in the end, was not dramatic. It was built from dozens of small choices made every night. Where to place a blanket, when to wake, how much wood to burn, who slept where. None of it felt historic at the time. It was simply another night, and then another, And then, slowly, fewer of them. By the later part of winter, fatigue settled in as deeply as the cold itself. Frontier families did not talk about being tired. Everyone already knew. Sleep deprivation was assumed, like frost on the ground. You functioned anyway. You always did. Nights developed a pattern that felt endless but predictable. The fire dimmed. Someone woke. Wood was added carefully, never too much. Blankets were adjusted. A child shifted and was gently pulled back. Then stillness returned. This cycle repeated until morning arrived, quietly and without reward. Mental sharpness dulled in winter. Decisions took longer. Tempers shortened slightly, then disappeared again under exhaustion. Arguments were rare at night. Conflict required energy, and energy was reserved for survival. If there was disagreement, it waited for spring. Frontier families became very aware of heat loss. Every opening mattered. Chimneys were adjusted. Doors were opened as little as possible. Even speaking too loudly felt wasteful. Sound did not warm anyone. Silence did not cost anything. Sometimes the cold was so intense that sleep became impossible. On those nights, people lay awake, listening to the fire struggle, counting breaths, waiting for dawn. This was not panic, it was patience. You did not fight the night, you endured it. Hands suffered the most. Fingers cracked, stiffened, and lost sensation. Gloves were precious and often inadequate. At night, hands were tucked deep into sleeves or pressed against warmer bodies. Pain was dull and constant, like background noise. Feet were next. Cold floors stole warmth immediately. Getting out of bed in the dark felt like stepping into punishment. People delayed it as long as possible, negotiating silently with themselves before finally moving. Hesitation was universal. Winter nights also changed how people thought about the future. Planning beyond the season felt unrealistic. You planned for tomorrow morning, maybe for the next fire load. Anything further ahead belonged to warmer months. Ambition shrank to a manageable size. Despite everything, routines continued. Tools were repaired by firelight. Clothes were mended slowly, fingers clumsy in the cold. Small tasks filled the evenings, not to pass time, but to maintain usefulness. Idleness invited cold awareness. Work distracted from it. Stories, when told, were repetitive and familiar. No one wanted surprises. Familiar stories required less attention and carried less emotional weight. They settled the mind. Children drifted off mid-sentence. Adults pretended not to notice and kept speaking softly until silence took over. Outside, winter nights erased evidence of life. Tracks vanished under fresh snow. Smoke drifted briefly, then disappeared. Frontier cabins became islands of faint warmth in a landscape that did not acknowledge them. This isolation felt normal after a while. Animals adjusted too. Mice found their way inside seeking heat. Families tolerated them reluctantly. Chasing them away cost warmth. Traps were set quietly. Coexistence lasted until spring made choices easier. When injuries happened at night, they were handled calmly. A cut, a burn, a fall. Panic was avoided. Blood froze quickly. Clean cloths were scarce. Care was improvised. Healing was slow. Survival mattered more than comfort. Occasionally, nights brought moments of unexpected calm. The fire held steady. Wind paused. Snow fell softly. In those moments, the cabin felt almost peaceful. People noticed but did not comment. Acknowledging comfort felt risky, like tempting winter to return stronger. As winter dragged on, memory blurred. Individual nights lost distinction. Cold became a continuous experience rather than a series of events. People stopped thinking of nights as obstacles and started seeing them as background. Then one night, without ceremony, something shifted. The fire lasted until morning without attention. Breath did not freeze on walls. Getting up hurt slightly less. No one announced it, but everyone sensed it. Winter was loosening its grip. Frontier families did not celebrate this at night. They waited. Winter had taught them patience. Relief came slowly, the same way hardship had arrived. Until then, they kept doing what they had always done: shared warmth, careful fires, quiet endurance. Another night survived, not memorably, not heroically, but successfully. And for them, that was enough. By the final stretch of winter, the cold felt less aggressive, but more exhausting. Frontier families were worn down, not defeated. Energy was thinner, movements were slower. Nights were approached with the same routines, but with a deeper sense of patience that came from knowing there were only so many of them left. Cabins carried the evidence of long, cold months. Walls were darkened by smoke. Floors were scuffed and uneven from constant use. Bedding smelled of fire, wool, and dampness that never fully disappeared. Nothing felt fresh. Everything felt used, and that was acceptable. Sleep remained shallow. Bodies had learned not to fully relax. Even when the fire held steady, people woke frequently, checking without thinking, listening for changes in wind or the soft collapse of embers. Rest was partial, but it was enough to function. That had become the standard. Winter taught restraint. Fires were still controlled carefully. Wood piles were checked often, measured by eye and instinct. Nobody assumed abundance, even near the end of the season. Overconfidence was a mistake winter punished quickly. Clothing showed the strain. Wool thinned, seams loosened. Repairs were visible and constant. Nighttime mending continued, hands stiff and awkward. The goal was not perfection, only usefulness. A patched sleeve that kept out wind mattered more than appearance. Children marked the passage of winter differently. They grew quieter. Games were fewer. Energy was saved instinctively. Laughter still happened, but it was softer, brief, quickly replaced by stillness. They learned endurance without being taught. Meals grew simpler as supplies ran low. Portions were measured carefully. Nighttime hunger was familiar, tolerated rather than discussed. Warmth from food mattered as much as fullness. Stews were stretched. Fat was valued. Nothing was wasted. Illness lingered but slowly eased. Coughs softened. Fevers became less frequent. Survival had already filtered the weakest moments earlier in the season. Those still standing adapted and waited. Night after night, same small decisions continued. Where to sit, when to add wood, how close to sleep. These choices required less thought now. Habit had taken over. Winter had trained them well. Outside, signs of change were subtle. Snow crust softened slightly. The air carried a faint dampness instead of pure, sharp cold. Animals moved differently. These signs were noted quietly. Nobody trusted them completely. The emotional weight of winter nights eased slowly. Fear was replaced by fatigue, then by cautious expectation. People did not talk about spring arriving. They talked about tomorrow morning. Hope stayed small on purpose. When storms returned late in the season, they felt more frustrating than frightening. Families knew what to do. They endured them with tired efficiency. Experience had replaced uncertainty. This did not make storms pleasant. It made them manageable. One night, someone noticed that the fire had burned lower than usual without waking anyone. Morning arrived anyway. The room was cold, but not unbearable. This was acknowledged silently. It felt important but fragile. Soon after, light lingered a little longer in the evenings. Darkness did not rush in quite as early. People noticed because their routines were disrupted. Winter's rhythm began to loosen. Even then, no one relaxed fully. Fires were still fed carefully. Blankets stayed layered. Caution remained. Winter had earned that respect. The final cold nights were not dramatic. They passed like the others, just slightly easier. The fire lasted. Breath fogged less. Ice retreated slowly. Nothing ended suddenly. When spring finally took hold, frontier families did not look back on winter nights with pride or nostalgia. They looked forward. The cold had been survived, not conquered. It left behind worn tools, thinner bodies, and a quiet confidence that came from having endured something long and unremarkable. Those nights were never meant to be remembered individually. They blended together into one long test of patience and habit. And when they were finally over, frontier families adjusted again, just as they always had. Because survival, on the frontier, was never about dramatic moments. It was about lasting long enough for the nights to change. When winter finally released its hold, it did not announce itself. Frontier families noticed the change the way they noticed everything else, quietly, cautiously, and a little late. Nights were still cold, but they no longer felt endless. The darkness lifted sooner. The fire seemed less demanding, almost cooperative, which felt suspicious at first. Sleep slowly deepened, though habits were hard to break. People still woke in the night out of instinct, listening for problems that no longer arrived as often. Blankets were adjusted automatically. Someone reached for the fire and realized it did not need attention. This caused a brief moment of confusion, followed by careful relief. Cabins began to dry out. Damp bedding felt lighter. Walls stopped collecting ice. The air lost its sharp edge and took on a softer heaviness that suggested melting snow somewhere outside. Mud replaced ice, which was not an improvement, but it was different. Different was welcome. Morning routines shifted. Fires were rebuilt instead of rescued. Hands moved more easily. Stiffness lingered, but it no longer defined every movement. People stood a little taller, not from pride, but from reduced pain. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as if reluctant to leave entirely. Food tasted slightly better, even when it was the same. Bodies responded to warmth quickly, reminding everyone how much they had been holding back. Hunger remained, but it felt manageable instead of urgent. Meals were eaten without the same calculation, though caution never fully disappeared. Children noticed change first. They moved more. They talked more. They lingered near doors, curious about the outside world that had been sealed off for months. Adults allowed this, but watched closely. Spring could still mislead. Winter had taught them not to trust early signs. At night, silence felt different. It was no longer heavy with risk. Sounds outside returned gradually. Dripping water, shifting snow, occasional animal movement farther away instead of uncomfortably close. The world widened again, slowly reclaiming space beyond the cabin walls. Sleep became something closer to rest. Dreams changed. People dreamed of work to be done, not just warmth. Fields, repairs, journeys. The future extended beyond the next morning. Planning crept back carefully, like a limb waking up after being numb too long. Still, habits remained. Clothing stayed close. Fires were never ignored completely. Blankets were not discarded, just folded differently. Winter left behind caution as a permanent resident. Frontier families carried it forward, even in warmer months. Looking back, the coldest nights blurred together. There was no single worst one, no clear turning point. Just a long stretch of endurance that eventually loosened its hold. Survival did not arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly, one managed night after another. People did not talk about what winter had taken. Weight loss, exhaustion, illness, grief. Those things were understood without discussion. Talking about them did not bring them back. Moving forward felt more useful. Spring brought work, and work brought distraction. Repairs waited. Fields demanded attention. Animals needed care. Life expanded quickly, filling the space winter had occupied. The memory of cold nights receded, though the habits remained embedded deep enough to return without warning. When the next winter came, and it always did, frontier families were not surprised. They prepared without drama. Wood was gathered, blankets were checked, gaps were sealed as best they could be. They knew what was coming. That knowledge did not make winter easier, but it made it familiar. And familiarity on the frontier was a kind of comfort. Surviving the coldest nights was never a story meant for retelling. It did not fit into heroic language. There were no speeches, no defining moments, just quiet choices repeated over and over until repetition became resilience. Frontier families survived because they accepted discomfort as temporary and routine as essential. They shared warmth, they conserved resources, they rested lightly, they woke up. Night after night, season after season. Not because they were exceptional, but because they adapted. And when the nights finally softened, they adapted again, which, in the end, was the only skill that truly mattered. Long after the coldest nights were over, frontier families still carried winter with them. It lingered in habits that no longer made strict sense but felt impossible to abandon. Fires were watched more closely than necessary. Blankets were kept within reach even on milder evenings. Someone always listened in the night, just in case. Sleep never returned fully to what it might have been before. Even in warmer months, people woke easily. A sudden noise, a change in wind, the absence of familiar sounds. Winter had trained the body to stay alert. Deep, careless sleep belonged to another kind of life. Cabins, too, remembered winter. Wood warped and settled. Cracks widened, then were patched again. Smoke stains remained as a permanent reminder of months spent indoors. These marks were not cleaned away. They were accepted as part of the structure, proof that the place had done its job. Conversations about winter were brief and practical. People mentioned how much wood had been used, which repairs had held, which blankets needed replacing. There was little reflection. Winter was not analyzed, it was reviewed for efficiency. Children carried the experience differently. Some forgot quickly. Others retained small behaviors like sleeping closer together or keeping clothes nearby at night. These habits faded slowly, replaced by new routines as seasons changed. But traces remained, ready to return when cold demanded it again. Frontier families did not romanticize what they had endured. They did not speak of character being forged or spirits tested. Winter was not a teacher, it was a condition. You learned from it because failing to do so had consequences. When neighbors gathered after winter, there was a quiet recognition among them. No one asked detailed questions. Everyone already knew the answers. They compared losses gently. A sick child recovered, an older relative did not. A roof held, another collapsed. These exchanges were factual, without ceremony. Nighttime, once feared and respected, slowly returned to being just night. Darkness became less threatening. Cold retreated into memory. But memory stayed close enough to influence behavior. Lamps were still used sparingly. Doors were still closed quickly. Waste still felt dangerous. Season by season, this pattern repeated. Frontier life was defined less by single hardships than by cycles of adjustment. Winter demanded endurance, spring demanded labor, summer demanded preparation, autumn demanded caution. Night after night, year after year. Those coldest nights shaped how people understood comfort. Comfort was no longer warmth alone. It was predictability, a fire that behaved, a roof that did not shift in the wind, a routine that held even when conditions worsened. These small securities mattered more than luxury ever could. Visitors, if they came from more settled places, sometimes misunderstood this mindset. They mistook quiet for lack of emotion, restraint for indifference. Frontier families did not correct them. Explaining endurance felt unnecessary. If someone stayed long enough, winter would explain it on their behalf. As years passed, stories of early winters grew shorter, not longer. Details were lost. Only the essentials remained. The cold, the fire, the waiting, the waking. These were enough. When children grew into adults and built cabins of their own, they repeated what they had seen. Fires placed carefully, beds arranged for warmth, night routines established without discussion. Knowledge passed silently, through observation rather than instruction. The coldest nights were never treated as milestones. They were not dates remembered or events marked. They were a stretch of time survived, then folded into the past. Their importance lay in what they changed, not in how they felt at the moment. Even in old age, frontier survivors slept lightly. They rose early. They trusted preparation more than hope. Winter had taught them that waiting without planning was not patience, it was risk. In the end, surviving the coldest nights did not make frontier families proud. It made them practical. It sharpened their sense of what mattered and stripped away what did not. Excess comfort, unnecessary movement, wasted energy. These things fell away quickly in winter. What remained was habit, careful fire tending, shared warmth, quiet cooperation, respect for night. These were not dramatic lessons. They were slow ones, learned over long, dark hours when there was nothing else to do but endure. And when winter returned, as it always did, frontier families did not brace themselves emotionally. They adjusted practically. They gathered wood, they checked roofs, they stacked blankets. Because the coldest nights were never unexpected. They were simply part of the rhythm. And rhythm, once learned, was easier to follow than to fear. Even decades later, former frontier families could still feel winter in their bodies when night fell. A subtle tightening of muscles, a habit of checking doors twice, an instinct to sit closer to warmth, even when the air was mild. The coldest nights had passed, but they had rewritten expectations permanently. Night, in particular, never fully returned to innocence. Darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It carried memory. On the frontier, night had been a working condition, something to be managed carefully. Even after comfort improved, that understanding remained. People prepared for night the way others prepared for storms. Firelight stayed important long after necessity faded. Lamps were kept low. Bright light felt wasteful, even rude. Soft, steady illumination was preferred. It reminded people of survival rather than excess. Too much light felt like tempting the dark to respond. Sleeping arrangements remained conservative. Beds stayed close. Extra blankets remained folded nearby, never far away. People did not scatter themselves across rooms at night. Proximity still meant safety, even if danger was no longer immediate. Weather awareness sharpened permanently. A drop in temperature, a shift in wind, a strange stillness outside. These details were noticed automatically. Winter had trained attention carefully, and that training did not fade. People trusted observation more than forecasts or optimism. Frontier children who grew up hearing very little about winter still understood it deeply. They learned by watching. They saw how adults closed doors quickly, how fires were banked at night, how supplies were counted before sleep. Instruction was rarely verbal. Behavior was enough. Nighttime discipline remained strict long after winter loosened its grip. Late wandering, unnecessary noise, careless movement. These habits were discouraged gently but firmly. Old lessons did not require explanation. They were reinforced by repetition. In settled towns, this mindset sometimes appeared excessive. Others slept easily. They left doors open longer. They trusted abundance. Frontier families noticed, quietly, and adjusted their expectations downward. They never assumed conditions would remain favorable just because they had been so recently. Comfort, when it finally became available, was approached cautiously. Soft beds felt strange at first. Warm rooms felt suspicious. People adjusted slowly, allowing themselves small improvements without surrendering preparedness. Luxury arrived, but routine stayed in control. Winter nights had also reshaped ideas of cooperation. Individualism softened in the face of shared survival. Sleeping together, sharing heat, coordinating fire duty. These experiences reinforced the understanding that endurance worked better collectively. Even later in life, frontier families favored closeness over solitude at night. Memory of cold did not fade dramatically. It thinned. Sharp edges dulled. Details disappeared. But the overall impression remained intact. Winter was not remembered as cruel or dramatic. It was remembered as long. That length mattered. It taught patience more effectively than any speech. Waiting through darkness, waking repeatedly, enduring discomfort without knowing exactly when relief would come. These were lessons learned slowly, absorbed deeply. Night after night, frontier families had learned that panic accomplished nothing. Preparation did. Attention did. Routine did. These principles carried forward into other parts of life. Illness, shortages, loss. Night taught responses that daylight later benefited from. When old frontier settlers spoke of early life, winter nights were often summarized in a single sentence. It was cold. Nothing more was required. Anyone who had lived it understood what that meant. Anyone who had not would never fully grasp it anyway. As time passed, physical reminders faded. Cabins were improved. Fireplaces replaced open hearths. Insulation arrived. Windows fit better. Night grew quieter and less intrusive. But the habits shaped during colder times stayed embedded beneath these improvements. The frontier mindset treated comfort as temporary and vulnerability as constant. This did not create fear. It created calm. Calm came from readiness, not from believing hardship would not return. Even generations later, descendants noticed small behaviors passed down without explanation. Extra blankets stored carefully. Firewood stacked neatly. Supplies checked before sleep. Doors closed softly but firmly at night. These habits felt normal, though their origins were rarely discussed. The coldest nights had done their work quietly. They had shaped behavior, sharpened awareness, and set expectations that lasted far beyond their season. No monuments marked them. No anniversaries remembered them. Their influence lived on in routine. Frontier families survived because they learned how to live with night instead of fighting it. They learned to respect darkness, manage cold, and accept discomfort without letting it dominate them. Night was never conquered. It was accommodated. And that accommodation, practiced over countless long, cold hours, became one of the most enduring skills frontier life ever produced. Not heroic, not dramatic, just effective. Night after night, until it wasn't necessary anymore. As years passed and the frontier slowly became less isolated, the memory of those cold nights shifted again. It moved from lived experience into inherited behavior. Frontier families did not sit down and explain winter to the next generation. They demonstrated it. Preparation happened quietly. Night routines were followed without discussion. Children absorbed the logic without ever hearing the lessons spelled out. Even when houses improved, people still behaved as if gaps might exist. Doors were checked before sleep. Fires were settled carefully. Someone always made sure there was enough fuel to last the night, even when running out was no longer likely. This was not anxiety. It was muscle memory. Nighttime became a period of calm rather than restlessness. Frontier descendants learned to appreciate stillness. Silence no longer felt empty, it felt controlled. A quiet house at night meant everything was in order. Noise suggested waste, disruption, or risk. These instincts were subtle but persistent. Cold tolerance also lingered. People who had grown up around frontier habits complained less about temperature. Discomfort was acknowledged but not dramatized. A cold room was something to adjust to, not something that demanded immediate correction. This perspective confused outsiders, but it worked. Sleep itself remained light. Even in safety, even in warmth, there was a readiness to wake. Night was respected as a time when attention mattered more than comfort. This did not mean people lived in fear. It meant they trusted routine to handle whatever arrived. Frontier winters had also redefined the meaning of warmth. Warmth was not only physical, it was structural. A roof that did not shift, walls that held, a fire that responded predictably. Warmth came from reliability as much as heat. This understanding carried into how families evaluated their surroundings. Night conversations, when they happened, stayed practical. There was little speculation. People talked about what needed to be done tomorrow, not about distant possibilities. Winter had trained focus inward and forward, one step at a time. Dreams were private, plans were modest. Seasonal awareness remained sharp. Even in improved conditions, winter was never underestimated. Supplies were still gathered early. Repairs were still completed before cold arrived. Waiting until the last moment felt irresponsible, even if consequences were no longer severe. The coldest nights had also shaped emotional expression. Strong reactions were rare. Excitement was muted. Fear was controlled. These traits were not praised, they were simply expected. Emotional economy mirrored resource economy. Waste was avoided. When hardship appeared in other forms later in life, financial trouble, illness, loss, the response often echoed winter behavior. Stay calm, conserve energy, focus on what can be controlled, wake up and continue. These habits were learned long before anyone called them resilience. Stories of the frontier, when told publicly, often missed this quiet reality. They focused on danger, conflict, and dramatic survival. But frontier families knew the truth was less exciting and more demanding. The hardest part was not a single crisis. It was the repetition. Night after night of managing small risks. Night after night of doing enough but not too much. Night after night of trusting routine over hope. This was the real work of survival, and it left the deepest impression. Over time, many frontier families moved away from the land that had taught them these lessons. They settled in towns, they adopted new technologies, they gained comfort. But the internal rhythm remained. Night was still treated carefully. Winter was still planned for. Waste still felt uncomfortable. The coldest nights were never remembered as a challenge overcome. They were remembered as a period endured. That distinction mattered. Overcoming suggested an enemy defeated. Enduring suggested cooperation with conditions that could not be changed. Frontier families had learned to work with night, not against it. They learned when to move and when to stay still, when to add fuel and when to conserve, when to sleep and when to wake. These decisions were small, but they accumulated into survival. Even as the frontier faded into history, its nights lived on in behavior. Extra blankets stored neatly, firewood stacked carefully, doors closed firmly at dusk, silence valued, preparation respected. These habits were rarely questioned, even when their original purpose was forgotten. They felt right. They felt sensible. They felt like the correct way to approach night. And that was perhaps the most lasting legacy of the coldest frontier nights. They taught generations how to live quietly within limits, how to endure discomfort without panic, and how to trust routine more than optimism. Not through instruction, not through stories, but through repetition, night after night, until it became normal. And when something becomes normal, it no longer feels heroic. It simply feels necessary. Which, on the frontier, was always enough. In the very long view, the coldest nights on the frontier became less about weather and more about mindset. Long after technology softened their impact, the habits born in those nights continued to shape how people approached uncertainty. Night was no longer feared, but it was never taken lightly. It remained something to prepare for, something that deserved attention. Frontier families learned early that night stripped life down to essentials. What mattered after dark was simple: warmth, shelter, proximity, and predictability. Anything beyond that faded in importance. This lesson stayed with them, influencing choices far beyond winter. Even in abundance, they favored what was reliable over what was impressive. Homes reflected this thinking. Spaces were arranged for function first. Furniture stayed close to walls. Pathways remained clear. Nothing unnecessary cluttered the areas used at night. Movement in the dark needed to be safe and familiar. This was not aesthetic preference. It was inherited caution. Nighttime rituals persisted quietly. Before sleep, doors were checked. Fires, or later stoves, were settled. Water was placed where it would not freeze, then later where it would be easy to reach. These actions became automatic, performed without conscious thought. Skipping them felt wrong, even when consequences were unlikely. Frontier descendants often struggled to explain this behavior to others. When asked why they prepared so carefully, the answer was usually vague. It's just how we do it. The original reason had faded, but the behavior remained intact. The cold had taught the lesson thoroughly enough that it no longer needed explanation. Silence at night continued to feel valuable. Loudness felt disruptive. Excessive movement felt careless. Even laughter softened after dusk. This was not repression, it was efficiency. Noise did not help anyone sleep. Quiet conserved energy and attention. Winter also reshaped how people viewed rest. Rest was no longer a complete shutdown. It was a controlled pause. You slept, but you stayed aware. You relaxed, but you remained ready. This balance became normal. Deep, oblivious rest felt unnatural, even when safety allowed it. Generations later, these patterns surfaced in subtle ways. People woke easily. They noticed changes in temperature before others did. They kept emergency supplies without feeling anxious about it. Preparedness brought calm, not fear. It allowed sleep to come, light and steady. The frontier taught that night was not the enemy. Neglect was. Forgetting to check the fire, forgetting to seal a gap, forgetting to plan for the hours when help would not arrive. These were the real dangers. Attention prevented most problems before they grew. This mindset extended beyond winter. Storms, illness, financial hardship. The response was familiar. Reduce waste, focus on essentials, maintain routine, wait it out without panic. Night had trained them well for endurance of all kinds. Importantly, this did not make frontier families joyless. Warm months were enjoyed fully. Daylight was appreciated deeply. Comfort was savored when it came. But comfort was never assumed permanent. It was treated as a phase, not a guarantee. Stories told later often missed this nuance. They portrayed frontier survival as dramatic and violent, full of singular moments of courage. The reality was quieter and far more repetitive. Survival was built from hundreds of ordinary nights handled competently. No single night taught the lesson. It was the accumulation. Each cold evening reinforced the same message. Prepare early, move carefully, share warmth, expect discomfort, wake up and continue. Repetition turned effort into instinct. This instinct became invisible over time. People no longer recognized it as learned behavior. It felt innate, a natural way to approach night, winter, and uncertainty. Only when contrasted with other lifestyles did its origins become apparent. In a modern context, these habits sometimes appear excessive. Extra blankets, backup plans, conserved resources, but they carry a quiet confidence. They reduce surprise. They replace fear with familiarity. The coldest frontier nights were never about triumph. They were about adjustment, adjusting expectations, adjusting routines, adjusting how much comfort you required in order to function. Once adjusted, survival followed naturally. Even today, traces of this mindset surface in small decisions. Turning off unnecessary lights, closing doors fully, preparing before resting. These actions feel minor, but they echo centuries-old lessons learned in cabins where night demanded respect. Frontier families survived not because they were tougher than others, but because they accepted limits without resentment. They worked within those limits patiently. Night was one of those limits. Cold was another. Neither could be argued with. So they adapted. They learned when to act and when to remain still. When to conserve and when to spend energy. When to sleep and when to wake. These choices, repeated endlessly, built a rhythm that carried them through winter after winter. That rhythm outlasted the frontier itself. It moved quietly into settled towns, into newer homes, into generations who never slept in log cabins or tended fires through the night. The conditions changed, but the habits remained. Because the coldest nights had taught something durable, that survival is rarely loud. It is repetitive. It is careful. It is quiet. And most of all, it is patient. night after night, until night no longer needs to be feared. In the end, the frontier did not disappear so much as it dissolved into routine. The coldest nights were absorbed into behavior so thoroughly that they stopped feeling like history and started feeling like common sense. People no longer remembered why they did certain things at night. They only knew that doing otherwise felt wrong. Preparation before sleep remained a small ritual even generations later. A final walk through the house, a glance at doors and windows, a check that everything was where it should be. This took only moments, but skipping it created a quiet unease. The habit was older than memory, passed down without explanation. Night itself retained a certain seriousness. Even in safety, even in comfort, it was treated as a different state from day. Day was for expansion, night was for maintenance. You did not experiment at night. You relied on what you already knew worked. This distinction came directly from frontier winters, when mistakes after dark were costly. People raised with this mindset often found it difficult to sleep in unfamiliar places. New rooms lacked the known sounds, the trusted patterns. Silence felt different. Shadows felt untested. Sleep came eventually, but lightly. Familiarity, not luxury, remained the true requirement for rest. The relationship with cold also stayed practical. Cold was not dramatized or ignored. It was acknowledged, adjusted for, and managed. Complaining felt unproductive. So did pretending it was not there. The appropriate response lay somewhere in between. Put on another layer, add fuel, move closer together, then continue. Frontier nights also shaped patience in a specific way. Waiting became active rather than passive. You waited while listening. You waited while checking. You waited while staying ready. This kind of waiting did not feel wasted. It felt responsible. The skill transferred easily to other parts of life. Even language reflected this background. People spoke softly at night without being asked. Movements were controlled. Doors were closed deliberately, not carelessly. These behaviors did not come from rules. They came from long familiarity with nights that demanded respect. When hardships arrived later, unrelated to weather, the response often mirrored winter routines. Reduce unnecessary activity. Secure what matters. Stay close to others. Avoid panic. Let time pass while you remain attentive. This approach did not eliminate difficulty, but it prevented it from spiraling. Frontier families rarely framed this as wisdom. They would not have recognized it as philosophy. To them, it was simply how things were done. Others might call it resilience or discipline. They would have called it normal. Importantly, this mindset did not erase joy. It clarified it. Warmth was appreciated more deeply after cold. Rest was valued because it was earned. Light mattered because darkness had once been heavy and demanding. Pleasure did not disappear. It became precise. Nighttime comfort, when available, was enjoyed quietly. A steady fire, a room that stayed warm until morning, sleep uninterrupted. These moments were noticed but not celebrated loudly. Drawing attention to comfort felt unnecessary and perhaps risky. Winter had taught that conditions could always change. The frontier also taught acceptance of limits. Not every problem could be solved immediately. Some nights simply had to be endured. This understanding reduced frustration. You did what you could, then waited. Fighting the night did not make it shorter. As frontier life faded into the past, its nights remained as a template. New technologies replaced old ones, but the structure stayed similar. Heat sources changed, insulation improved, clocks appeared. Still, the basic approach to night endured. Prepare before rest, reduce risk, stay attentive, share warmth, whether physical or social. Expect discomfort occasionally. Wake up and continue. These principles did not belong only to winter. They applied broadly. They made life quieter, steadier, less reactive. They reduced surprise by narrowing expectations to what could be controlled. Modern retellings of frontier life often search for moments of crisis, attacks, storms, dramatic rescues, but those moments were rare. What defined survival was far less exciting. It was the accumulation of ordinary nights handled competently, night after night of doing just enough, night after night of avoiding small mistakes, night after night of choosing caution over ease. This repetition built endurance more effectively than any single act of bravery. Frontier families did not see themselves as surviving history. They were simply living within conditions that demanded attention. The coldest nights were part of that demand. They shaped behavior quietly, without instruction, without ceremony. When those nights finally loosened their grip, they left behind habits rather than stories. Habits lasted longer. Stories faded. Behavior remained. Even now, traces of this legacy appear in unexpected places. Someone checks the weather before bed out of instinct. Someone prefers a familiar routine at night. Someone sleeps better knowing everything is in order. These impulses feel personal, but their roots are collective and old. The coldest frontier nights taught that control was limited, but preparation was powerful. You could not command warmth to stay. You could only arrange conditions so that when cold arrived, it did less harm. This lesson required no explanation. It was learned through repetition, discomfort, and time. It became embedded so deeply that it no longer felt like learning at all. It felt like the natural way to approach night. Quietly, carefully, without expecting drama, just doing what needed to be done, and then doing it again the next night, until eventually, night softened, and life adjusted, as it always did. Eventually, the memory of the coldest nights settled into something almost invisible. Frontier families no longer thought of those winters consciously, but their influence remained embedded in how night was handled. Evening brought a natural slowing of movement. Tasks were finished deliberately. Nothing important was left for later. Night was not rushed into. It was entered carefully. This careful transition became a kind of unspoken boundary between effort and rest. Day demanded action. Night demanded maintenance. The shift was subtle but firm. Voices lowered. Movements softened. Attention narrowed. These changes happened automatically, without discussion, because they had once mattered deeply. Even when winters grew milder, habits remained unchanged. Fires were still banked with care. Heat sources were respected. People preferred steady warmth over sudden bursts. Consistency mattered more than intensity. A room that stayed tolerable all night was better than one that felt warm briefly and cold later. Frontier descendants often trusted routine more than reassurance. Being told that everything was fine mattered less than seeing it arranged properly. Doors closed, supplies accounted for, light placed where it belonged. Order created calm more effectively than words ever could. Night also taught humility. You could prepare carefully and still be uncomfortable. You could do everything right and still wake cold. This reality reduced frustration. Effort was valued for its own sake, not for guaranteed comfort. Success meant reducing harm, not eliminating it entirely. This perspective shaped expectations in subtle ways. People did not expect perfect sleep. They expected manageable sleep. They did not expect complete comfort. They expected adequacy. These modest expectations made endurance easier. Disappointment had less room to grow. Over generations, this mindset blended into broader cultural behavior. People became good at waiting without agitation. They accepted delays. They tolerated inconvenience, not because they enjoyed it, but because they understood that resistance wasted energy. Night had taught them patience, the slow way. The coldest frontier nights also changed how people understood safety. Safety was not the absence of threat. It was the presence of preparation. Knowing where tools were, knowing how to respond if something failed, knowing who would wake if needed. This knowledge created calm even when conditions were harsh. As society modernized, many of these behaviors were no longer strictly necessary, but they remained useful. They reduced chaos. They smoothed transitions. They made nights quieter and more predictable. Even without cold pressing in, these habits made rest feel earned and secure. Frontier families never framed this as wisdom to pass on. There were no lessons taught explicitly. Children learned by watching evenings unfold the same way every night, by noticing what adults did just before sleep, by absorbing the rhythm rather than the explanation. Over time, this rhythm became background. It did not feel restrictive. It felt stabilizing. Night was not something to fill aggressively with activity. It was something to respect. Darkness did not need conquering. It needed managing. Even celebrations adapted to this understanding. Gatherings ended earlier in winter. Fires were tended first, conversations second. Fun adjusted itself around survival rather than competing with it. Joy existed, but it did not override caution. The coldest nights had taught that small mistakes accumulated quickly after dark, forgetting a task, leaving a gap open, wasting fuel. These errors were rarely catastrophic alone, but together they made nights longer and harsher. Avoiding them became second nature. As a result, frontier families grew skilled at preventing problems rather than reacting to them. This skill transferred easily to other parts of life: maintenance over repair, preparation over apology, quiet attention over dramatic response. Night, in this worldview, was not passive time. It was active restraint, doing less, but doing it intentionally, conserving energy, letting systems run smoothly, intervening only when necessary. This approach reduced exhaustion and preserved focus. The coldest nights eventually faded into the past, but they left behind a blueprint for endurance, one that did not rely on strength or bravery, but on steadiness, on habits that worked whether conditions were harsh or mild. When modern life introduced new uncertainties, economic shifts, technological change, social disruption, this blueprint remained relevant. Stay close to what works, reduce waste, maintain routines, sleep lightly if needed, wake ready. Frontier families had learned that endurance did not require constant effort. It required consistency. The same actions repeated reliably mattered more than bursts of energy. Night after night of doing enough was better than one heroic attempt to do everything. In this way, the coldest nights shaped a quiet philosophy, one that valued patience over speed, familiarity over novelty, adequacy over excess. It was not spoken, it was lived. And because it was lived so thoroughly, it persisted long after the frontier itself was gone. Even now, when someone settles a room before sleep, checks a door without thinking, prefers steady warmth to dramatic comfort, or sleeps best, knowing everything is in order, they are echoing those old nights. Not consciously, not nostalgically, just practically. The coldest frontier nights did not demand remembrance, they demanded adjustment. And adjustment, once learned deeply enough, never really goes away. It simply becomes the way night is handled. Quietly, carefully, without fuss, until morning comes. And then you do it again the next night, if needed, which, for the frontier, it usually was. In the quiet aftermath of those winters, frontier life continued to move forward without pause. The coldest nights were not marked as chapters that ended cleanly. They faded the way frost fades from a window, slowly, unevenly, leaving faint traces that only caught the light at certain angles. People did not stop preparing at night simply because the weather improved. Preparation had become a form of reassurance. Even in summer, evenings followed a familiar pattern. Tasks were finished before dark whenever possible. Tools were put back where they belonged. Doors were closed with intention, not habitless force. Night still demanded order, even when it no longer demanded heat. This carried over from winters when forgetting a single step could cost comfort, or worse. Sleep, too, remained shaped by experience. People slept lightly, but not anxiously. There was a difference. Light sleep meant awareness without fear. It meant waking easily, adjusting if necessary, and returning to rest without frustration. This balance had been learned slowly, through months of broken winter nights where fighting wakefulness only made exhaustion worse. Frontier families understood that resistance wasted energy. If you were awake, you were awake. You listened, you checked, you adjusted. Then you rested again. This approach carried into all seasons. It made nights less dramatic and days more manageable. Over time, this mindset influenced how people thought about control. The frontier taught that control was partial at best. Weather did not respond to will. Darkness did not negotiate. Comfort could be improved, but never guaranteed. Accepting this reduced anger and disappointment. You worked within limits instead of resenting them. This acceptance did not mean giving up. It meant choosing where effort mattered. Fire tended carefully, gaps sealed as best they could be. blankets shared. These were practical actions with real impact. Complaining, wishing, or rushing rarely helped. Winter rewarded patience more than urgency. As frontier settlements grew and conditions improved, these lessons remained quietly embedded. New materials replaced old ones. Better stoves replaced open fires. Glass windows replaced shutters. But the nightly rhythm stayed the same. Preparation still came before rest. Familiar routines still brought calm. Children raised in these environments inherited this rhythm without explanation. They learned when evening truly began, not by the clock, but by behavior. Voices softened, movement slowed, attention narrowed. Night was treated differently from day, not because of superstition, but because history had taught that this difference mattered. Frontier nights had also shaped social bonds. Sharing warmth required trust. Sleeping close required cooperation. Fire duty required reliability. These experiences created quiet interdependence. People learned to rely on one another without ceremony. Help was expected, not requested loudly. This carried forward into daily life. Communities functioned on mutual awareness rather than constant communication. People noticed when something was off: a light not lit, a fire not burning, a door not opened in the morning. These observations mattered, especially after winters had taught what silence could mean. In later years, when life became safer and more predictable, these instincts sometimes seemed unnecessary. But they rarely caused harm. If anything, they made life steadier, fewer surprises, fewer emergencies. Nights passed uneventfully, which was always the goal. The coldest frontier nights had also refined how people measured success. Success was not comfort, it was continuity. Waking up, functioning, repeating the process. This definition removed pressure to feel satisfied or heroic. It focused on outcome rather than experience. This mindset proved useful far beyond winter. During illness, people rested without panic. During shortages, they conserved without despair. During uncertainty, they waited without agitation. Night had trained them to understand that time itself could be a solution if handled properly. Frontier families rarely spoke about this directly. They did not frame their experience as philosophy. They lived it. Language was unnecessary. Behavior carried the lesson forward more effectively than words ever could. When modern observers look back at frontier life, they often search for moments of drama. But drama was rare and unsustainable. What truly carried people through was repetition. The same actions performed calmly night after night until conditions changed. Cold did not break frontier families because it did not surprise them forever. Once understood, it became another factor to manage. Night did not terrify them because it followed patterns. Even the harshest conditions became tolerable once predictable. This predictability was the true achievement of surviving the coldest nights, turning uncertainty into routine, turning danger into manageable risk, turning fear into attention. By the time the frontier era faded, these lessons had already outlived their original context. They moved quietly into new homes, new generations, new challenges. They no longer belonged only to winter. They belonged to night itself. To the idea that rest does not require perfection, that comfort does not require excess, that safety does not require absence of threat, only readiness. Frontier families survived their coldest nights not by overcoming them, but by understanding them. And understanding, once learned deeply enough, does not disappear when conditions improve. It simply becomes the way you move through darkness, calmly, carefully, one night at a time, until morning arrives, without drama, as it always does. And then, quietly, you begin again. By the time the frontier era slipped fully into memory, the coldest nights had already done their quiet work. They no longer needed to announce themselves through hardship. Their influence lived on in patterns so ordinary that no one thought to question them. Night arrived, and people responded the way they always had, by settling in, by reducing movement, by making sure nothing important was left unattended. What remained most clearly was a sense of proportion. Frontier families learned that not every discomfort required fixing. Some things were meant to be endured briefly and adjusted around. This understanding prevented panic. It also prevented waste. Energy, resources, and attention were spent only where they made a real difference. Even in improved conditions, this mindset stayed intact. People preferred systems that worked quietly over ones that promised dramatic improvement. A steady heat source mattered more than a powerful one. A routine that held mattered more than one that looked impressive. Reliability had proven itself night after night. The coldest nights also reshaped how people understood time. Waiting stopped feeling passive. It became an active skill. You waited while listening. You waited while staying ready. You waited without assuming relief would arrive quickly. This patience carried into other areas of life, smoothing reactions to uncertainty and delay. Night, once a test of survival, became a test of discipline instead. Could you maintain routine? Could you avoid unnecessary action? Could you trust preparation to do its work while you rested? These questions were answered quietly every evening, without discussion. Frontier families rarely described themselves as cautious. They would have said, practical. Caution implied fear. Practicality implied experience. The cold had not frightened them into carefulness. It had trained them into it. This training also shaped how people dealt with silence. Silence was not awkward. It was informative. It told you whether systems were functioning as they should. A quiet night meant the fire was holding, the structure was sound, and nothing urgent required attention. Silence became reassuring rather than empty. As modern life grew louder and faster, traces of this preference remained. Some people still slept better with predictable sounds, a steady hum, a familiar creak. Absolute silence felt unsettling, like something was missing. These preferences were not random, they were echoes. The frontier had taught that the most dangerous moments were not loud ones. They were the quiet failures. A fire that faded unnoticed, a door left slightly open, a task forgotten because it seemed small. Avoiding these failures required attention, not strength. Strength was never the defining factor. Endurance was. Endurance built from habits simple enough to repeat even when tired, cold, or discouraged. This was why frontier survival looked unremarkable from the outside. It relied on consistency rather than effort. When people later spoke of their ancestors, they often mentioned toughness, but toughness missed the point. The frontier did not reward toughness. It rewarded adaptability. Those who adjusted their expectations survived more easily than those who resisted conditions emotionally. The coldest nights made this clear. Fighting the cold wasted energy. Working around it conserved it. Acceptance was not surrender. It was strategy. Over time, these strategies became indistinguishable from personality. Someone was described as calm, steady, unflappable. Rarely was it acknowledged that these traits had been shaped by long nights where agitation offered no benefit. The frontier also redefined what enough meant. Enough warmth, enough food, enough rest, enough light. Enough to function until morning. This restrained definition of sufficiency reduced anxiety. Wanting more than enough created frustration. Wanting enough created focus. Even now, this idea appears in subtle ways. People arrange their evenings to ensure the next day starts smoothly. They prefer preparation to improvisation. They value predictability at night, even if they enjoy spontaneity during the day. These choices feel personal, but they are inherited. The coldest frontier nights were never meant to teach lessons. They simply demanded responses. The lessons emerged afterward, shaped by what worked and what did not. Over time, ineffective behaviors disappeared. Effective ones remained. This process required no memory. It required no storytelling. It required repetition, night after night, until the response became automatic. By the time winter loosened its grip for the final time, frontier families did not feel victorious. They felt adjusted. The night no longer demanded as much from them, but they were ready if it did. That readiness, more than warmth or shelter, was the true product of those nights. A readiness that did not shout, that did not show off, that simply existed, steady and quiet. In modern retellings, this subtlety is often lost. Survival is portrayed as dramatic, loud, and urgent. The reality was slower. Survival was boring. It was built from evenings that looked exactly like the one before. The fire was checked. The doors were closed. The room was settled. People lay down, fully dressed or not, alert but calm. They slept lightly. They woke when needed. They went back to sleep. Nothing memorable happened. And that was the point. The coldest nights on the frontier were survived not because people rose to the occasion, but because they never stopped showing up to the routine. They did not wait for motivation. They relied on habit. Habit carried them through darkness. Habit carried them through cold. Habit carried them into morning. And when morning arrived, quietly and without reward, they stood up, did what needed doing, and prepared to do it again when night returned. Because on the frontier, night always returned. And when it did, they were ready. Not dramatically, not heroically, just adequately, which, for survival, turned out to be exactly enough. With enough distance, the coldest frontier nights became less about survival and more about calibration. They adjusted how much people expected from the world, from comfort, from themselves. Expectations shrank to a size that reality could meet. This made life steadier. When you expect little, being functional feels like success. Frontier families learned to trust small indicators: a steady flame, a door that closed fully, a roof that did not creak too much in the wind. These details mattered more than forecasts or hopes. At night, certainty lived in what you could see and hear directly. Anything beyond that was speculation, and speculation was not useful at 2 a.m. This focus on the immediate carried into rest itself. Sleep was not treated as an escape. It was treated as maintenance. You slept to restore enough energy to continue. Dreams were incidental. Comfort was secondary. Waking up mattered more than drifting off pleasantly. Over time, this stripped sleep of drama. Insomnia was not a personal failure. It was a condition to manage. If you were awake, you stayed calm. If you were cold, you adjusted. If you were uncomfortable, you shifted carefully. You did not lie awake judging yourself for it. Judgment wasted energy. The coldest nights also taught that most problems did not announce themselves loudly. They arrived quietly. A draft you did not notice at first. A fire that burned lower than expected. A blanket that slipped off without waking you fully. Preventing these issues required attention before they became obvious. This encouraged vigilance without anxiety. Frontier families became skilled at noticing absence, the absence of sound, the absence of warmth, the absence of routine signals. Silence itself carried information. At night, silence could mean everything was fine, or it could mean something had gone wrong. Experience taught the difference. This sensitivity did not fade easily. Even in calmer settings, people noticed when things felt slightly off. A room that cooled too quickly. A door that did not latch the same way. A sound that did not belong. These details were rarely discussed. They were simply addressed. Winter nights also reshaped how people thought about effort. Overexertion was dangerous. Doing too much too quickly could leave you exposed later. Effort had to be measured. Enough to maintain warmth. Enough to secure shelter. Enough to last. Excess was not impressive. It was irresponsible. This perspective softened ambition without eliminating it. Goals existed, but they were paced. Expansion waited for daylight. Night was for preservation. Mixing the two caused problems. Frontier families learned to respect this boundary instinctively. As the frontier stabilized, this approach created a kind of quiet confidence. People did not rush to prove competence. They assumed it would show through consistency. Reliability mattered more than speed. Night rewarded those who moved deliberately. Even social interactions adapted to this rhythm. Evening conversations stayed grounded. Speculation and argument belonged to daylight. At night, people preferred agreement or silence. Disagreement cost energy and created tension that did not help anyone rest. This habit sometimes made frontier descendants appear reserved. They were not withholding, They were conserving. Conversation, like fuel, was used where it mattered most. The coldest nights also taught that help, when it came slowly. You could not rely on rescue after dark. This encouraged self-sufficiency, but not isolation. Families stayed close. Neighbors mattered. Cooperation increased safety more effectively than bravado ever could. Over time, this created communities that functioned quietly but efficiently. People noticed when someone failed to appear in the morning. They noticed when smoke did not rise. They responded without panic because panic did not speed anything up. Night had taught them that urgency was often counterproductive. Calm responses lasted longer. In modern contexts, this approach sometimes feels out of place. Speed is valued, constant activity is encouraged, but the old habits persist in subtle ways. People still prefer evenings that wind down instead of ramp up. They still feel better when tomorrow is prepared for tonight. They still sleep better when nothing feels unresolved. These preferences are not arbitrary. They are the residue of nights when unresolved problems could not be fixed easily after dark. The coldest frontier nights left behind an understanding that control is limited, but preparation is powerful. You cannot stop night from arriving. You cannot stop temperature from dropping. You can only arrange yourself to meet those conditions with minimal harm. This understanding reduced fear. Fear thrives on unpredictability. Routine reduced unpredictability. Night became something to navigate, not something to dread. Frontier families did not articulate this philosophy. They lived it. They adjusted behavior based on what worked, and they dropped what did not. Over generations, the effective patterns remained. When people later romanticized the frontier, they focused on conflict and conquest. They missed the quieter reality. Most nights were not exciting. They were procedural. The same actions repeated until morning. This repetition was not dull to those living it. It was reassuring. Familiarity reduced cognitive effort. You did not have to think hard at night. You followed the sequence. Check the fire, close the door, settle in. Listen. Sleep lightly. Wake if needed. Nothing dramatic happened. And because nothing dramatic happened, people survived. The coldest nights did not create heroes. They created habits. Habits that functioned under stress. Habits that required little motivation. Habits that could be maintained even when tired, sick, or discouraged. These habits did not disappear when winter ended. They adapted. They softened. They became less necessary, but no less present. Even now, when someone prepares a space before rest, prefers steadiness over intensity, or accepts discomfort without agitation, they are echoing those nights. Not consciously, not ceremoniously, just practically. The frontier taught that survival rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly, one unremarkable night at a time. And by the time you realize you have survived, the work has already been done. As the years stretched on, the coldest nights lost their sharp edges and became something closer to background pressure. Frontier families did not feel relief so much as a steady easing. The work of night grew lighter, but the structure of it remained. People still prepared as if conditions might turn without warning, because sometimes they did. Nightfall continued to signal a narrowing of focus. Tasks were wrapped up, decisions were deferred. What remained was care and containment. This rhythm had proven itself too many times to abandon. Even when warmth was reliable, the habit of readiness felt comforting rather than burdensome. Frontier life had taught that uncertainty was most dangerous when met with impatience. Rushing rarely helped. Waiting intelligently did. So nights were approached with deliberate slowness. Movements were efficient, not hurried. The goal was stability, not speed. This mindset subtly influenced how people aged. Older frontier survivors often appeared calm in situations that unsettled others. Long nights had taught them that discomfort did not automatically signal danger. It might simply require adjustment. This distinction saved energy and reduced fear. Night also refined trust in process. If you followed the routine, most problems resolved themselves or stayed manageable. If something did go wrong, the routine helped you notice it early. This reduced the need for constant vigilance. Attention could rest lightly on the system instead of scanning for disaster. The coldest nights had also taught people when not to act. Not every noise required investigation. Not every discomfort required correction. Overreaction could be as costly as neglect. Learning this balance took time and repetition. Winter provided plenty of both. Over generations, this balance shaped a particular kind of steadiness. Frontier families became comfortable with partial solutions. A draft reduced, not eliminated. A fire stabilized, not perfected. A night endured, not conquered. These outcomes were sufficient, and sufficiency was respected. This respect for sufficiency softened disappointment. When things were merely adequate, that was acceptable. Wanting more was allowed, but not required. This made life feel less fragile. Small failures did not unravel the whole structure. Even language reflected this restraint. People used fewer absolutes. Nights were cold, not unbearable. Sleep was light, not ruined. Words were measured, as if exaggeration itself might disturb balance. This habit of understatement made endurance easier to share quietly. Frontier families also learned that night was not a time for reinvention. Innovation belonged to daylight. After dark, you relied on what you already trusted. New ideas were risky when visibility was low and consequences were immediate. This division of time reduced mistakes. As settlements stabilized, this approach quietly shaped productivity. Daytime became more focused because night was protected. Rest, even imperfect rest, was valued as preparation rather than reward. This perspective kept people functional over long periods of strain. When frontier descendants later encountered new kinds of hardship, economic downturns, migration, loss, the response often followed the same pattern. Simplify, stabilize, reduce movement, preserve energy, let time do part of the work. These strategies did not eliminate difficulty, but they prevented collapse. The coldest nights had also clarified the role of hope. Hope was useful, but unreliable. Preparation was dependable. Frontier families hoped winter would ease, but they acted as if it might not. This combination prevented despair without encouraging complacency. Night after night, this balance was practiced until it felt natural. Hope existed quietly in the background. Preparation handled the foreground. Modern observers sometimes misinterpret this attitude as pessimism. It was not. It was realism shaped by experience. Frontier families did not expect the worst. They expected conditions to vary, and they prepared accordingly. This realism reduced emotional volatility. When nights were harsh, it was expected. When nights were easier, it was appreciated, but not assumed permanent. Emotional reactions stayed within narrow bounds, conserving energy for practical tasks. As the frontier era faded, these habits became less visible, but no less present. They merged into what people called common sense. Prepare before resting. Do not rely on luck. Keep things simple at night. Trust routines that have already worked. The coldest nights no longer needed to be remembered actively. Their lessons had already been absorbed. Behavior carried them forward silently. Even now, when someone prefers evenings that slow down rather than speed up, or feels uneasy resting before everything feels settled, they are responding to an old logic, one learned when night could still undo the careless. That logic does not demand fear. It demands attention. Attention to small details, attention to timing, attention to limits. Frontier. Families survived their coldest nights by respecting those limits without resentment. They did not ask night to be gentle. They arranged themselves to endure it. And endurance, practiced patiently and repeatedly, became easier over time. Not because the nights improved quickly, but because the response did. Night after night, the same quiet adjustments, until winter loosened, until memory softened, until the routine remained even when the hardship did not. And in that routine, built slowly in darkness and cold, frontier families found something durable. Not comfort, not heroism, but steadiness, which, when night returns, is usually the most useful thing to have. Over very long stretches of time, that steadiness became the defining inheritance of frontier life. The coldest nights did not leave behind dramatic memories so much as a way of approaching difficulty that felt quietly reasonable. When something was uncomfortable, you adjusted. When something was uncertain, you prepared. When something could not be changed, you waited. Night was where this approach was practiced most consistently. Day allowed for optimism. Day invited effort and expansion. Night, especially in winter, demanded restraint. Frontier families learned to downshift without resentment. This ability to reduce intensity without feeling defeated was rare, and it served them well. They understood that night magnified small problems. A loose shutter felt louder. A thin blanket felt thinner. A missed task felt more serious. So they aimed to reduce variables before dark. Not because they expected disaster, but because fewer surprises made endurance easier. Predictability was its own form of comfort. This predictability did not come from rigid control. It came from familiarity. Knowing how the fire behaved, knowing how the wind moved around the cabin, knowing which sounds belonged and which did not. Over time, night became legible. It could be read, interpreted, and managed. Frontier families became fluent in this quiet language. A sudden silence outside meant snow. A certain whistle in the walls meant wind shifting. A deeper cold near the floor meant the fire would need attention before morning. These signals required no alarm. They were noticed calmly and addressed when necessary. Because of this fluency, panic rarely took hold. Panic thrives on confusion. Night was no longer confusing. Even when it was harsh, it was familiar. Familiar hardship felt less threatening than unfamiliar comfort. This familiarity extended to discomfort itself. Being cold was unpleasant, but it was not shocking. Being tired was inconvenient, but it was expected. These states did not provoke dramatic emotional reactions. They were treated as conditions to manage rather than crises to escape. Over time, this approach reshaped emotional responses. People learned not to amplify discomfort by fighting it internally. Complaining, worrying, replaying worst-case scenarios, all of that consumed energy without producing warmth or rest, so it faded away naturally, replaced by quieter focus. Frontier nights taught that attention was more valuable than emotion. Attention noticed drafts. Attention noticed fading embers. Attention noticed when someone nearby shifted restlessly. Emotion did not fix these things. Attention did. This emphasis carried into how people cared for one another. Care was practical rather than expressive. Extra blankets placed without comment. A child pulled closer in sleep. Fire duty taken without complaint. These acts mattered more than reassurance spoken aloud. Night was also when hierarchy softened. Everyone was equally subject to cold. Age and status mattered less than usefulness. Whoever woke easiest tended the fire. Whoever was warmest shared space. Authority yielded to practicality. This created quiet cooperation. As frontier families moved through repeated winters, they stopped measuring nights individually. Nights blurred together. What mattered was not how bad one night was, but whether the system held across many nights. Success was cumulative. This long view reduced reactivity. A bad night did not feel catastrophic if the nights before and after were manageable. One failure did not define the season. This perspective made endurance psychologically easier. In later years, when life presented extended difficulties, long illnesses, drawn-out financial strain, slow recovery from loss, this same perspective proved useful. You did not judge the entire situation based on one hard night. You focused on maintaining the system. The system, in this case, was routine, preparation before rest, attention without panic, adjustment without drama. These elements created a buffer against despair. They did not remove hardship, but they prevented it from overwhelming everything else. Frontier families rarely spoke about this consciously. They would not have described themselves as patient or resilient. They simply knew what worked. What did not work faded away. Night sharpened this process. There was little room for inefficiency after dark. Mistakes were felt immediately. Corrections were learned quickly. Over time, the most efficient behaviors remained. Even after winters softened and nights grew kinder, these behaviors stayed. They no longer felt like survival tactics. They felt like good habits, reasonable habits, habits that made life smoother regardless of conditions. This is why the coldest frontier nights are difficult to romanticize accurately. They did not produce constant fear or heroics. They produced systems, quiet, repetitive systems that allowed people to function under strain. Those systems were not exciting to watch. They were not memorable in isolation, but they were durable. They scaled across months, years, and generations. By the time the frontier itself receded, the knights had already done their work. They had trained people to respect limits, to value predictability, and to accept discomfort without surrendering agency. Knight no longer needed to teach these lessons actively. They had become embedded. People responded correctly without knowing why. They felt uneasy when routines were skipped. They felt calmer when things were settled. This inheritance shows itself even now, in small ways. A preference for finishing tasks before bed, a desire to check on things one last time, a sense that rest comes easier when tomorrow feels prepared for tonight. These instincts are not random. They are echoes of nights when being unprepared had consequences that could not be fixed easily until morning. Frontier families survived the coldest nights not by being fearless, but by being attentive, not by being strong, but by being consistent, not by winning against winter, but by arranging life so winter could do less harm. Night after night, this arrangement was practiced, and practice, repeated long enough, stopped feeling like effort. It became normal, which, in the end, is how the hardest conditions leave their deepest mark, not through memory, but through habit. Quiet, patient habit, carried forward into nights that are no longer so cold, just in case they ever are again. Eventually, the frontier nights stopped demanding constant explanation, even from those who had lived through them. The behavior they shaped no longer felt connected to cold or darkness. It simply felt like the sensible way to end a day. Night became a checkpoint rather than an interruption, a moment to stabilize things before letting go of conscious effort. Frontier families learned that endings mattered. How you ended a day affected how the night behaved. Loose ends carried weight after dark. An unfinished task was not just inconvenient, it lingered mentally, disturbing rest. So evenings were used to close loops. Tools returned, fires set, plans simplified. Completion created calm. This attention to closure carried forward into many areas of life. People preferred finishing things cleanly rather than leaving them half done. Not because they were obsessive, but because incompleteness felt like an open door in winter. Something cold could get in. Night also taught respect for thresholds. The moment between activity and rest was treated carefully. You did not collapse into sleep abruptly. You transitioned. This reduced mistakes. It reduced regret. It allowed the body and mind to shift gears gradually, which made endurance possible over long periods. Frontier families understood that rushing rest made it fragile. If you went to bed unprepared, you woke repeatedly. If you slowed down and prepared properly, sleep, however light, held together better. This lesson stayed useful long after fires and drafts stopped being daily concerns. There was also an acceptance that some nights would simply be poor. No amount of preparation guaranteed comfort. Wind changed, temperatures dropped unexpectedly, bodies ached. These nights were not treated as failures, were part of the range. Expecting perfection only made them harder to tolerate. This acceptance reduced frustration. People did not waste energy being angry at the night. Anger did not warm anyone. It did not shorten darkness. So, it was allowed to fade. What remained was attention and patience. Frontier nights trained people to notice improvement without demanding it. A night that was slightly less cold than the previous one was appreciated quietly. A fire that lasted longer than expected was noted mentally. These small wins accumulated into morale without needing celebration. This approach to morale was subtle but effective. Instead of waiting for dramatic relief, people allowed incremental improvement to sustain them. Winter eased slowly, and their expectations were matched to that pace. This alignment prevented disappointment. The coldest nights also clarified the difference between effort and strain. Effort was necessary. Strain was optional. Doing what needed to be done was unavoidable. Doing more than necessary was wasteful. Frontier families learned to distinguish between the two through repetition. At night, this meant no unnecessary movement, no unnecessary talking, no unnecessary worry. Stripping life down to essentials conserved energy for when it truly mattered. This discipline did not feel restrictive. It felt protective. As these habits spread across generations, they lost their original urgency but retained their usefulness. People still found comfort in order before rest. They still preferred evenings that wound down rather than escalated. They still slept better when the environment felt settled. Modern explanations for these preferences vary. Some call it discipline, some call it anxiety, but its roots lie elsewhere. They lie in nights when being careless after dark had consequences that lingered until morning. Frontier families did not analyze this deeply. They did not need to. The behavior worked. What works tends to persist. Night also taught forgiveness toward oneself. You could do everything right and still wake cold. You could prepare carefully and still feel exhausted. This did not mean you had failed. It meant conditions were larger than effort. Accepting this reduced self-blame. This forgiveness extended outward as well. People were less judgmental of others' limitations. Everyone had cold nights. Everyone had low-energy days. Expecting constant strength was unrealistic. Endurance mattered more than intensity. The coldest nights created a long-term relationship with discomfort that was neither fearful nor indulgent. Discomfort was acknowledged, addressed where possible, and tolerated where not. This balanced response prevented both denial and obsession. In later life, when frontier survivors encountered comfort that was more consistent, they did not reject it. They accepted it calmly. Comfort was pleasant, but not central to identity. Losing comfort did not feel like losing control. It felt like returning to a familiar state. This flexibility made adaptation easier. When conditions improved, they adjusted. When conditions worsened, they adjusted again. The skill was not tied to any specific environment. It was portable. That portability was the frontier's quiet gift. It produced people who could function under a wide range of conditions without needing to narrate their experience dramatically. They did not need to prove toughness. They had already learned what they could endure. Night after night, this learning had been reinforced, not through lectures or reflection, but through lived repetition. The body learned before the mind articulated anything. Behavior changed first. Understanding followed later, if at all. This is why the coldest frontier nights resist clean storytelling. They do not fit into arcs of struggle and triumph. They lack a single turning point. Their impact is cumulative and subtle. What they left behind was not a story, but a rhythm of preparation before rest, a rhythm of attention without panic, a rhythm of acceptance without resignation. This rhythm did not demand constant awareness. It ran quietly in the background, guiding choices automatically. Even now, when someone feels uneasy going to bed with unfinished business, or finds relief in setting things in order before sleep, or prefers steady conditions over dramatic ones, they are following that old rhythm. They may never know why it feels right. They do not need to. The frontier nights did not require understanding. They required adjustment. And once adjusted, life continued, quietly, night after night, until the night was no longer a threat, just another part of the cycle, handled the same way it always had been, carefully, patiently, without expecting applause, until morning came, and then, naturally, the work began again. In the long run, frontier nights taught something that did not sound impressive, but proved endlessly useful. Most problems shrink when approached calmly and consistently. The coldest nights were not defeated through force or cleverness. They were made manageable through repetition. The same actions performed quietly, night after night, until uncertainty lost its edge. This repetition changed how people related to difficulty. Difficulty stopped feeling personal. A cold night was not a failure. It was a condition. You met it the same way you met the previous one. Adjust the fire, adjust the blankets, adjust expectations, then continue. Emotional distance made endurance possible. Night was where this distance was practiced. In darkness, without distractions, there was little room for dramatizing discomfort. The body wanted warmth. The environment provided limited options. The mind learned to cooperate rather than argue. This cooperation became habit. Frontier families also learned that improvement rarely arrived suddenly. Waiting for dramatic change led to disappointment. Instead, they watched for small shifts, slightly warmer air, less ice on the walls, fires that held a little longer. These changes mattered precisely because they were modest. They suggested direction without promising speed. This way of noticing progress prevented despair. If you expected winter to end abruptly, every cold night felt like a failure. If you expected it to loosen slowly, each tolerable night felt like confirmation. Expectation shaped experience. Over time, this adjustment of expectation became second nature. People stopped measuring life against ideal conditions. They measured it against what was workable. This did not make them passive. It made them realistic. Realism reduced wasted effort. Night also clarified what was worth protecting. Heat, shelter, people. Everything else became negotiable. Appearance, comfort, convenience. These faded in importance after dark. This hierarchy stayed in place even when conditions improved. People remembered what truly mattered. This memory influenced decisions far beyond winter. When resources were limited, priorities were clearer. When time was scarce, effort was focused. When uncertainty returned in new forms, the same hierarchy applied. Protect essentials, let the rest wait. Frontier nights had also trained patience with repetition itself. Doing the same thing again did not feel pointless. It felt stabilizing. Repetition meant predictability. Predictability reduced cognitive load. When tired, you did not need to decide. You followed the sequence. This was especially valuable at night, when decision-making was costly. The fewer choices required, the better sleep held together. Routine acted as a substitute for willpower. You did not need motivation to tend the fire. You simply did it. Even boredom played a role. Long, uneventful nights dulled the desire for novelty. Novelty after dark often meant risk. Over time, people grew comfortable with sameness. Sameness felt safe. This comfort with monotony later translated into resilience during long periods of difficulty. Frontier families did not seek stimulation to distract themselves from discomfort. Distraction required energy. They sought stability instead. Stability reduced the need for distraction. This approach shaped social expectations as well. People did not demand excitement from one another at night. Conversations slowed. Silence was allowed. Presence mattered more than entertainment. Sharing space was enough. These values were not framed as virtues. They were simply what worked. The cold rewarded them consistently. Anything else faded away through disuse. As conditions improved, these habits softened but did not disappear. People still preferred evenings that settled rather than escalated. They still found reassurance in familiar routines before sleep. They still trusted preparation more than optimism. Modern life sometimes treats this as caution or even dullness. But the frontier taught that dullness was survivable. Chaos was not. The coldest nights also refined trust in oneself. You learned that you could function without ideal rest, that you could wake, adjust, and continue. This confidence was quiet but durable. It did not rely on feeling strong. It relied on knowing what to do when you were not. Night after night, this knowledge accumulated. Not consciously, not ceremonially. It embedded itself in behavior. When frontier families eventually told stories about their past, they rarely lingered on nights. There was nothing to say. They were cold. They were long. They were handled. Words added little. What remained instead were patterns: how people moved at night, how they prepared before rest, how they responded to discomfort. These patterns outlasted memory. Even now, traces of them appear in small choices: turning down lights instead of turning them up, finishing tasks before sleep, preferring steady systems over dramatic solutions, feeling calmer when tomorrow feels accounted for tonight. These impulses are not nostalgic. They are practical. They come from a logic forged in conditions where logic mattered more than feeling. Frontier families survived the coldest nights by learning when to act and when to wait, when to conserve and when to spend energy, when to accept discomfort and when to correct it. This balance was refined slowly, through repetition rather than reflection. The night was their training ground. It offered no shortcuts. It responded only to consistent behavior. Over time, that behavior became instinctive. And once instinctive, it became transferable. When the frontier faded, the instinct remained. It moved into towns, into different climates, into lives shaped by different challenges. The conditions changed, but the response stayed useful. Because uncertainty never truly disappears, it only changes form. And the skills learned in the coldest nights, attention, restraint, preparation, patience, remain relevant whenever certainty thins. Night after night, in one form or another, handled the same way it always was, quietly, carefully, without expecting resolution, just waiting, until morning arrives, and then doing what needs to be done, again.